Now here's a 6.4 Powerstroke in its natural state, which is broken. So this is a truck I've had for a long time. So it hasn't been running for a long time either. What's wrong with it is the high pressure fuel pump. And you're not looking at it right now because it is way down in there. Both Ford and the internet say you have to pull the cab off of the frame in order to get at that pump, or at least unbolt the body and jack it up some in order to get access to it. I'm going to be doing neither of those things, and when I'm done you're going to see that you can also do neither of those things. Now I was planning to just pull the battery tray out and move this thing over to where the battery tray is, because I don't want to drain the coolant out. I don't want to deal with that. But this is a prime example of why engineers suck. If you look real closely, and if my phone would focus, those aren't two pieces. The coolant bottle and this giant battery tray are one piece. So if you're hoping to just do the same thing I was hoping to do, move the coolant bottle over and out of your way, that's not going to happen. There's nowhere for it to go being part of this thing. So you're either gonna lose some coolant and take it out, or you're gonna try and work around it, which is what I'm gonna do. I haven't gotten too far here yet, but one thing I want to show, if you're wondering if your high pressure fuel pump is dead, you can figure that out very simply. Now in my case, I didn't get any codes. I don't know if that's because I have a tuner or what, but I got no codes at all. And the only symptom was that it started randomly dying. I had to be driving and then all of a sudden, nothing. Now I don't know if this is going to show up. I hope it does. Oh yeah, you can kind of see some flecks there. If you find little flecks, little metal flecks, or little metal chunks even, in this fuel filter reservoir, you're looking at doing your high pressure pump. And the reason for that is this. The way this works is the fuel is coming in here, then it's coming back around. This is not a return system. This is a recirculating fuel system where the fuel goes through the injectors and then back up through here, through your fuel cooler, and back down into your bowl. And that's where the metal comes from. So if you see metal in here, your pump's finished. And another thing about these fuel coolers, I've read online about guys deleting these things and so on. Don't do it. That is a really, really bad idea. This fuel cooler is not there for emissions or any of that crap. This thing's there because, well, it has to be. The fuel that goes through the fuel rails is pressurized to 11 gazillion psi. It's gone through a hot engine, hot rails, and then it's getting pumped back through into here. If you didn't have this fuel cooler in there, what would happen is the fuel would just keep heating up, and then it would start boiling, it would start aerating, and you'd toast your injection pump in no time flat. Don't get rid of that thing. That's a necessity. Fuel filter housing comes out with 3 bolts. 1, 2, and 3. And this one has a stud on it that holds this wiring harness on. Fuel lines, this one's 17 mil, 19 mil, and this one you're gonna need one of these tools for. Oil cooler lines, there's 2 banjo bolts, one back here, one right here, 17 millimeter on both of them. Down here there is a, what size is that again? 8 mil bolt that holds this flange down, and the oil line itself just pulls right out afterward. It's sealed up by this O-ring, and when I say pulled right out, I mean I fought with this sucker for a good 5 minutes, and it came out with a poof of dust Don't force it, it will come out. Maybe spray some penetrating oil down in there or something. But that is all that's holding it in. So if you're having trouble getting it out, just keep ginger carefully. That whole fuel cooler assembly needs to be dealt with at some point, so no better time than now. You're gonna have to drain it. And that's not too big a deal. This one right here, this is your the heat exchanger for your fuel cooler. So you just got your hoses in the bottom there, pop them off and let her drain. There we go. One trick if you're having trouble getting these hoses off, and this works for all rubber hoses, is just to grab a pair of pliers. I use some curved needle nose, and just grab the hose around where the nipple is. Just start working it back and forth, and just keep moving up and down, moving it back and forth until the hose starts to turn on that hose barb, and then you'll be able to slide it right off, no problems. And also don't forget to take the cap off of this reservoir, or it's not going to drain it. We got the fuel coolant reservoir off. There's two 10mm bolts up here, and then there's one sneaky little bugger right down there. Fuel cooler has 6 bolts holding it on. There are these 2 bolts in the back here. Those are 13mm. There's a couple of nuts on the front here. Those are also 13mm. And then also in the back here, there's 2 little ones. Those are 10mm for some reason. And then this thing can just slide off. And this bracket can also slide out. Now for this turbo elbow, there are 3 studs down here. This cable, I just pulled it out and moved it off to the side. But you got 3 studs here. This stud holds on the oil dipstick as well, but that can just get shoved to the side. These are 13mm. And in here, come on now. Oh, there we go. Right there, there is another stud. For some reason that's 10mm instead of 13. And over here, another stud with a 10mm nut on it. And this thing can just come right off. Oh, and by the way, these things have rubber seals. That's all that actually seals this thing to the turbos. Heat shield for the turbos. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 8mm bolts. One back here. And 1, 2 there. One here. And one down here. Well, here's where you get to learn from my mistakes. I decided to take off the VGT actuator. Figured it would just give me a little bit. I just like having things open. And that is bolted on with these 3 bolts. They're 10mm. Fortunately, I managed to break the actuator shaft. That's the little doohickey that does the diddly-doos in there. I'll take a second to talk about this mess back here. Doesn't really make a lot of sense at first blush. So first, obviously you have your downpipe here. This is where everything's going out the back. But right here, there's quite a bit going on. It's actually pretty simple. This right here, this whole chunk right here, this is where the exhaust is coming into the turbos. There's 2 pipes, one here, one there. They each go to an exhaust manifold. This mess here is just for emissions. This thing connects down into that up pipe, and it goes over here And it goes right down here to this fitting. This flange is going to be where one of your EGR coolers bolts onto. Since I've deleted this, there's no more EGR cooler. I've got the down pipe unbolted, and it just drops. We'll let it drop as far as it would drop, and that will give you access to that bolt there. Then you can get an extension, maybe with a little wobbly on it, and be able to get at that one pretty easily. Here's something that I haven't seen mentioned anywhere. Maybe I just haven't looked hard enough. The EGR pipe is tied together. You see that bolt right there? There's a little bracket that's tying the EGR pipe to the up pipe, and I'm not sure if it ties it to the block yet. I've looked at a few pictures on the internet. They just don't really show you exactly what's going on up there. But that has to be taken out one way or another in order to get that EGR pipe out independently of the up pipes. This is all it took to get at it. It looks worse than it is. 10mm. I don't know if this is going to show up at all on camera, but there it is. That's all it takes. Alright, well, we're skipping ahead a little bit. This truck always demands a sacrifice whenever I work on it, and usually that's blood and probably some of my sanity. This time it took my phone as well, and that's what I was making this video on. So I've got this camera that I've never used before. We'll see if I can finish the video up. So I've left the turbo in for now, and I'll try and show you a little bit of what I was doing here. So passenger side up pipe sitting kind of cattywampus there. That's because I unbolted it from the manifold. I wouldn't say you have to do that or anything, but it gave me a lot more access to the other up pipe. And since I'm replacing these anyways, why not just get ahead of the game? The other up pipe's still in there. It's just hanging out back there. It's all unbolted, but it's done, and that's the big job. This is really why guys lift the cabs, and I did it without lifting the cab, but it sucked. This was a really hard job. It involved ratchets, different extensions, a big ass bar to pry on the ratchets with. It was pretty crazy. And my bolts were really tight in the back of the turbo. Your mileage may vary on that, I don't know. I don't know if maybe that was just a weird thing with my truck, maybe because it sat so long. Those bolts were friggin' tight, man. Unbelievably tight. I'll show you the conglomerate of tools that I used for this. So, just some random adapters, extensions. Those bolts are 10mm. And this ended up kind of being my workhorse, really. Just a 10mm deep socket on a 3/8 ratchet, nothing too fancy. This is one of the bolts. This is one of the worst ones. I don't know if this is going to focus on it or what, so we'll find out in the end. But you can sort of see the shiny bits there. That's where the sockets were rounding off the head of the bolt, and that goes right down to the shank here. That is not just me slipping the socket off the head. That's how frickin' tight these were. I'm not using 12 points. That's a 6-point socket. That's a 6-point socket. I'm using the right sockets. The bolts were just so tight that it was trying to round the head off. So luckily my new up pipes came with new bolts, because I wouldn't reuse these. Okay, it's time to take these turbos out. So once you got the up pipes unbolted off the back, there's not really much else holding them in. These oil lines, the oil drain lines on the bottom, are just sort of slipped into them with O-rings. So there's nothing you need to unbolt there. You just have to be really careful when you're prying them. Come in on either side and try really hard not to do a thing like this with 2 bars if you can. Otherwise, just a little bit on each side at a time. And be really careful not to bust anything. Don't pry on this fuel line here. Don't go prying too hard on that rocker cover. Just be easy. Take your time. You don't want to be breaking stuff instead of fixing it. So they say that these things are really heavy. I guess I'm going to find out just how heavy they are. What do we have here? You know, if I'd pulled off that oil filter cap and the oil filter, I was thinking about it, and I didn't do it. And I wish I had now, but it's okay, it's not going to stop me. Okay, and we're out. Well, I mean, they're not light, but I wouldn't say that's the end of the world either. One thing I forgot to mention earlier was how the turbos are actually held in. So there's 2 of these big brackets, and they sit right here. There's one here, one here. There's dowel pins that locate the turbo housings, and these just sort of clamp the turbo housing down to this whatever the heck this thing is that bolts down to the block. The heads on these are 15mm, and they are really friggin' tight. You're gonna need a big breaker bar to bust these suckers loose. So now it's time to get these heat shields off. So this is actually 2 pieces. There's most of these are 10mm, but 2 of them I think were 8mm. One here, and then one down below the driver's side up pipe. And there's another bolt, 10mm, that would be hidden below the passenger side up pipe. And the rest are all 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 over here. This one holds down the this ground strap as well. And then they can come out in 2 pieces. Let's get these suckers pulled out. Okay, and here she is. So we're gonna have to get these fuel lines off before we can take the cover off. So it looks like the supply line here, it's got 2, yeah, there's gonna be 2 10mm nuts holding that down. And then this banjo nut is going to be all that keeps this in at this point, with it unbolted from the fuel filter housing. And then the return, I don't see anything holding it in here. Well, there probably is, but I might just unbolt it and try and shove it out of the way. And then these are the lines that go to your fuel rails. These you're supposed to replace. I think they're made out of aluminum or something like that, and they're torque to yield type of thing. So the kit that I've bought comes with new ones, so I'll be replacing them as you're supposed to. Well, fuel lines are out. I got the bolts taken out of this pump cover, There's 5 bolts total. There's 2 on each side, and then there's 1 in the front. There's none in the back. I already got it cracked loose a bit, so it's time for the big reveal. Look at that. There she is. Okay guys, it probably goes without saying, but I'll say it anyways. The most important thing you need to be worrying about as you get into this is cleanliness. You're dealing with access to your fuel system and your oil system. So off camera, almost every step I take, I bust out the vacuum cleaner and compressed air to make sure I get everything as clean as I can. Okay, next step is pulling out the gasket, which also contains the wiring harness. There's 2 plugs, one right here. You just pry just lightly on the end of this plug and off it comes. Same thing on this plug here. Off it comes. Okay, now find out how stuck on this gasket's gonna be. Stickier than I expected it to be. Now on the early 6.4s, apparently this gasket can be an issue. Lucky for me, that's what mine is. Apparently the wiring harness can chafe inside of it. Okay. Well, I don't actually see anything wrong with this wiring harness, but there it is. Next there's going to be, I think, 4 8mm Torx, or not, sorry, not Torx, hex head or Allen head bolts holding that pump in. One there. There's one there. Well, maybe there's only 3. We'll find out together. Time to find out if that's all it was. Got those 3 bolts out. Find out if this thing comes out. And it does. And it's actually a lot heavier than I was expecting. Wow. There she is. Wow, look at that. All that just to get at this friggin' thing. 3 whopping bolts holding the damn thing in. And it was all that work to get to it. Absolutely nuts. Well, let's talk a little bit about what the next steps are supposed to be here. So, if you take this truck to the dealership or any decent mechanic shop, the rocker covers are coming off. they're going to yank out your fuel rails and clean them out. They're probably going to replace a couple sensors. Good chance they'll replace your fuel injectors. They'll definitely be replacing your fuel lines. And then they'll be buttoning it all back up. But I am not a shop, and I'm debating not doing those things. The truck ran really good still. It was smooth and quiet. So I'm not going to recommend doing what I'm going to do. I am going to recommend you go ahead and pull those fuel rails out, clean them out, replace your fuel injectors, the whole 9 yards. That's the right way of doing it. You're probably going to want to be sitting down when you look at how much that costs, though. So chances are that your pump is not going to come with this drive gear. I'm not going to say it's impossible, but most reman guys don't include this gear. If you bought a used one, then you probably have it, but in any case, good chance you'll have to take it off, so let's take it off. Now it's a 15mm socket, as far as I can tell anyway, but the catch here is that it is reverse rotation, so you're going to be tightening it to loosen it. And that zapped off pretty darn easily. Okay. Okay, we're on camera number 3 now. This video is going to be a real dog's breakfast. So I don't have any footage of me pulling off that gear, unfortunately, but it's not pressed on. But you're not going to just pop it off either. Let's see this one. That's a tapered shaft. So the gear has a corresponding taper on the inside, and it just fits on tight. So the mesh of those two tapers with the torque of the bolt is what keeps this thing from spinning on the shaft. So you're going to need a puller, and I don't recommend getting a puller that goes around the outside of the gear. That's a good way to break the gear. Not saying it'll happen, but it could. The best way would be to get a puller that can go in through these grooves here, and then just pry up on the actual flange here. But be prepared for that. Do what you gotta do. That gear's not gonna just slide off. Alright, got my new pump, got the gear on. Ford specs that at 57 foot-pounds of torque. Don't forget that it's a reverse rotation. And I don't know how you could put that gear on backwards, but the internet says it's possible, so don't put the gear on backwards. They do give you a handy little hole right there that you can shove something into to hold this gear while you're torquing it up. Pump is in, gasket is in, harnesses are plugged in. The mounting bolts on that pump Ford specs out at 45 foot-pounds. Pump covers on. Ford specs those bolts at 114 inch-pounds. And don't forget the seal in here. Make sure you replace that. Alright, this step isn't strictly necessary, but it could save you a lot of heartache in the future. It doesn't take that long to set this up. I've read on these early Job 1 trucks that came with copper washers under those nuts, those banjo nuts up there, that sometimes they leak with the new rubber washers. So all I've done is I've basically reconnected the whole fuel system, put everything all back together temporarily, and I've pulled the Schrader valve out of that test port. Just ran a hose to any random container. And then down here, I have a battery charger connected directly up to the fuel pump. That's not complicated. It'll be real simple when you get under there and take a look. The fuel pump harness itself, the actual plug that goes to it, it's only 2 wires, it's plus and negative, so pretty easy to figure out. And yeah, I just turn her on, you can hear it run. Okay, Schrader valve's back in. I just used that to bleed the system out more or less. Battery charger's running. So far, dry as a bone. Alright, these shields are back on. I've got the up pipes, well, sort of in. The driver's side up pipes bolted in, that's the new one. The passenger side, after I realized how much extra room I had to get at that bolt, I decided I am going to leave that loose until after I put the turbos in, and then I'll bolt on that driver's side pipe first, and then I'll get the passenger side pipe bolted in. It's turbo time. I decided to put the downpipe in. It's a two-piece downpipe. I don't really have to put it in, but I'm trying to make this look as authentic as possible compared to what the average guy's going to be doing here. Don't forget to replace the O-rings. I mean, you should have a turbo install kit, so it should come with it, but you'll want to replace those. There's also a weird kind of a seal that goes in this part of the pedestal that's in the turbo itself. So that's all done. Yeah, everything's cleaned up. It's time to heave these beasts in. Light they aren't. That might be it. That sure looks like it. Okay. I'll just double check this all with a mirror. I'll lighten the mirror before I start cranking on it. When you're dropping the hold downs in, drop the hold downs in without the bolts and then put the bolts in after you've fished the hold downs more or less where they need to be. You'll thank me later. And tighten them up sort of in sequence. Don't do one side and then the other. Do one side a bit and then the other side a bit. You don't want to damage those oil drain seals. The torque on those 148 foot-pounds, which is pretty much the limit of my half-inch torque wrench. So I busted out Big Bertha, 3/4 inch. By the way, I put these bolts in between the two turbos just to keep them from coming apart while I was monkeying around with it all. These bolts shouldn't actually be here. I'm about to take them out, and if you put them in, make sure you take them out as well. I would bet money that between the heating and expansion of the two turbos, if you left these bolts in nice and tight here, there's a good chance you'll crack one of the turbo housings over time. Now I'm not even going to bother trying to get a torque wrench back in there. So I'm just going to tighten these bolts up to tight enough. Well, there we go. Up pipes bolted in, both of them. Down pipes clamped in. Proof can be done without lifting the cab. Look how much more room there is in here without that EGR crap. Every tool I use to install the up pipes and the down pipe. No fancy $50 snap-on sockets to be seen. Making progress. The intake piping is back in, fuel cooler's in, oil lines to the turbos are on. Make sure you replace those seals, that's very important. Next step, clean out this fuel filter housing. Those are, I'm going to pull that spout out just to be absolutely sure I can get this thing completely clean. Those are 8mm bolts, and some brake clean and compressed air should take care of that. Just make sure it is super clean. You want to get as much debris out of your fuel system as you possibly can. Go clean as a whistle. In case you've ever been curious, this right here is your fuel pressure regulator. Fuel system's all back together. You know what that means? It's time to bleed. This is the same setup that I had before when I was checking the fittings on top of the pump. So I've taken the Schrader valve out on that bleed fitting there. I've just run a hose to a container, and I have a battery charger jumpered directly to the pump. And she is doing stuff. So now I've put the Schrader valve back in, and it's time to build a little bit of pressure. Make sure this pump's doing what it's gonna do, and to make sure these fittings aren't gonna leak. I don't know if I said this before, but make sure you replace those washers. They're one-time use only. If you don't replace them, they will leak. Get our power source going again. Now there's probably still going to be air in this system. I don't know what it is with these things, but it's really hard to bleed out these fuel systems. And you're not going to see a lot of pressure out of this. This actually isn't the right place to check fuel pressure on these anyways. You should check it right after the pump. All I'm doing right now is just seeing if I can get a little bit of air out of this. But it's making a little bit. I usually find about 3 psi is what you're going to get, 3 to 5 psi just by letting it sit like this. It is time to fire this thing up and see what happens. Well, guess what, guys? Even after all that bleeding I did, there's still air in the fuel system. I've just been using this little cap and bleeding the gauge into it, and I'll just keep doing it until I don't get air out. So I've been dicking around with this thing for the better part of an hour. I got it to fire off once and then it died. 2 hours, boys! It took 2 friggin' hours to bleed this SOB. And it took that much diesel too, out of that tiny little spigot. I should probably talk a little bit more about how I bled the fuel system and how this works really. This bleed valve here, it does not have access to the high pressure side of the system. When you bleed through this, you're only bleeding the low pressure side. I've suspected for a while that there are check valves in the fuel rails, which would make sense, and I think this confirms it now for me. You still need to bleed the low pressure side. Obviously you need to get you need to get as much air out of that as you can before it gets to the pump. Air going through the high pressure pump is a really bad thing. You don't want that. You don't want aerated fuel going through it. You don't want flat out air going through it. It's bad. But you can't get that air out from here after it's gone through the pump without cranking it. The high pressure pump only runs when your engine turns. It's directly driven off the engine. So the only way to get air out of the high pressure side is to have the engine turning and the pump pushing. But you don't want that air coming back around. You want to be able to get it out of here after it leaves the high pressure system and enters the low pressure system. So first you have to get all the air purged out of the low pressure system, which is why I ran the pump and had this flushing through. But then it's just going to take time. There are kits that plug into that banjo bolt, as far as I know, you can crank it and it'll just bleed the system through for you, and that would probably be a heck of a lot easier than what I did, but I don't have one of those. So what I did was I cranked and bled, cranked and bled. I didn't just crank and try and get it started. Crank and bleed, crank and bleed. There were a couple times where I got it started and then it died, and especially towards the end it would start and it would want to keep running, but I didn't let it. I just shut it back off and did some more bleeding, because every time you push a little bit of fuel into the high pressure system, it's pushing a little bit of air out of it, and that air is going to end up being able to come out through here. Okay, well, my first 6.4 high pressure fuel pump is in the bag. What would I have done differently if I was to do this again? Not that much. I didn't need to pull the battery tray out on the passenger side. Definitely that VGT actuator. Don't touch that. That was stupid. Should just left that right alone. Other than that, I think I would more or less do this job exactly the same way again. So I wouldn't recommend against doing this. If you don't have a hoist and you've got a 6.4 that needs a high pressure pump, well, since paying the dealer 10 grand to do it, just dive into it. You don't even need that much in the way of fancy hand tools. Well, I hope this video helps somebody out. Yeah. Happy wrenching.